The blood on her feet left faint streaks on the moonlit pavement as Mira Novik ran through streets she'd never seen before, her nightgown torn at the shoulder and her bare legs scraped raw. She didn't know where she was going, only that behind her, in the house with the yellow porch light and the neighbors who never asked questions, her husband David was probably still screaming her name, and if she stopped running, if she went back, this time he really would kill her. The thought propelled her forward even as her lungs burned and her vision blurred with tears. She'd run for 20 minutes, maybe more, leaving the familiar grid of suburban streets behind, until the landscape changed into something stranger. Wrought iron gates appeared between old oak trees, and the asphalt gave way to cobblestone paths that shouldn't exist in a modern city. But Mira didn't care about logic anymore. Logic was the voice in her head that had kept her trapped for 3 years, telling her that marriage meant commitment, that she'd made vows, that tomorrow he'd be sorry again. Logic had nearly gotten her killed tonight. The wall appeared suddenly, rising 15 feet high and covered in ivy that looked black in the darkness. Mira stumbled to a halt, pressing her bleeding hands against the cold stone as she gasped for air. Her ribs ached where David had kicked her, and she was certain at least one was cracked. But the wall continued in both directions as far as she could see, and she couldn't go back. She followed it to the left, then the right, searching desperately for a way through, until she found the gates. They were massive, ornate things of twisted iron that formed shapes she couldn't quite decipher in the darkness, perhaps wolves, perhaps something worse. And they were open. Not just unlocked, but standing wide as if waiting for her specifically. Mira's instincts screamed at her that this was wrong, that no one left gates like these open in the middle of the night, that she should turn around and find a hospital or a police station or literally anywhere else. But exhaustion and pain and 3 years of living in terror had worn her instincts down to nothing. So she stepped through. The guards materialized from the shadows so quickly that Mira screamed, stumbling backward. There were 2 of them, impossibly tall men dressed in dark formal clothing that looked like it belonged in a period drama rather than modern-day Seattle. But it was their faces that made Mira's heart stop. Bone-white skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Hair so pale it was nearly translucent, and eyes that reflected the moonlight like an animal's. The one on the left tilted his head as he studied her, his movements too fluid to be entirely human. "Please," Mira whispered, hating how broken her voice sounded. "Please. I just need somewhere to hide. Just for tonight. I'll leave in the morning, I promise. Please." The guards exchanged a look that Mira couldn't interpret. Then the one on the right spoke, his voice accented in a way she couldn't place, like he'd learned English centuries ago and never quite updated his pronunciation. "You're bleeding, I know." Mira looked down at herself, at the nightgown soaked with blood from a split lip, at her feet leaving red prints on the pale stone path. "I'm sorry, I'll clean it up." Her voice broke. "Please don't send me back there." The guards exchanged another look, longer this time. Then the one on the left gestured deeper into the grounds. "The king will want to see her." "Wait," Mira said, but they were already moving, flanking her on either side in a formation that was somehow both protective and threatening. She tried to focus on her surroundings as they walked, but everything felt dreamlike and surreal. The path led through gardens that shouldn't be possible, night blooming flowers in colors she'd never seen, fountains carved from black marble, and everywhere that same quality of wrongness that made her skin prickle with instinctive warning. This wasn't just a wealthy estate. This was something else entirely. The mansion rose before them like a Gothic fever dream, all sharp angles and tall windows with dark red curtains. It was massive, easily the size of a hotel, and constructed from the same pale stone as the wall. Lanterns burned with blue-white flames at intervals along the facade, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The guards led her up wide stone steps to doors that opened silently at their approach, and then Mira was inside, standing in an entrance hall that belonged in a vampire movie. The thought came unbidden, and with it a wave of hysterical understanding. The white skin, the reflective eyes, the old-fashioned formality. The fact that it was the middle of the night and everyone here seemed wide awake and alert. Vampires. She'd run straight into a nest of vampires because of course she had. Of course the first time she finally escaped David, she'd end up somewhere even more dangerous. But the guards hadn't attacked her, hadn't tried to stop her at the gates. And as they led her through corridors lined with oil paintings of pale figures in historical dress, past rooms filled with furniture that looked like museum pieces, Mira realized with a strange, detached calm that she wasn't afraid. Or rather, she was terrified. But it was a clean kind of terror compared to what she'd felt in her own home. These creatures might kill her, but at least there would be a reason for it. At least it wouldn't be someone who claimed to love her, who promised every time that he'd change. They stopped before a set of double doors carved with intricate scenes of forests and hunts. One of the guards knocked twice and a voice from within called, "Enter." The room beyond was some kind of study or office, shelves of ancient books lining 3 walls and a massive fireplace dominating the 4th. A desk sat before the fire, and behind it, in a high-backed chair that might as well have been a throne, sat the most beautiful and terrifying person Mira had ever seen. He was tall even sitting down, with the same alabaster skin and white hair as his guards, but there was something about him that made it clear he was different, more powerful, more dangerous. His hair fell past his shoulders, and he wore modern clothes, a black shirt and slacks, but somehow made them look regal. His eyes, fixed on Mira with an intensity that made her want to run all over again, were a deep crimson color that she knew shouldn't be possible. And his face, angular and aristocratic, held an expression of such controlled fury that Mira took an involuntary step backward. "My lord," one of the guards said. "She came through the gates, running bleeding. We thought, leave us." The Vampire King's voice was deep and commanding, with the same archaic accent as his guards but more pronounced. Both guards bowed and retreated immediately, closing the doors behind them. Then those crimson eyes were fixed on Mira again, and he rose from his chair in a single fluid movement. "Who did this to you?" It wasn't what Mira had expected him to say. She'd been bracing for questions about what she was doing here, or demands that she leave, or maybe just immediate death. "I what?" He moved around the desk, and Mira had to fight every instinct not to bolt. He was even taller up close, easily 6.5 feet, and he moved with a predator's grace that made her lizard brain scream danger. But he stopped a careful distance away, his eyes roaming over her injuries with that same contained rage. "You're covered in defensive wounds. You've been beaten recently and repeatedly. So I ask again, who did this to you?" "My husband," Mira heard herself say, and then to her horror she started crying. Great gasping sobs that made her cracked rib flare with pain. "My husband did this, and I ran, and I don't know where I am, and I think you're a vampire, and I'm going to die here, but at least it won't be him. At least he doesn't get to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't get enough air past the tears. The Vampire King made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a growl but close. Then, moving slowly as if approaching a frightened animal, he held out one pale hand. "My name is Alexander Voronin. I am, as you've deduced, a vampire, specifically, the king of the North American vampiric territories. You've run into lands that have been under my family's protection for 3 centuries, and I give you my word that you will not die here. Not tonight, not any night. You are under my protection now." Mira stared at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. In the firelight, he looked like something carved from marble, beautiful and cold and eternal. But his expression had softened slightly, and when she didn't move, he continued speaking, his voice gentler than before. "Your feet are bleeding badly, you're in shock, and if I'm not mistaken, you have at least 1 broken rib, possibly 2. I can have my physician attend to you, he's human, if that makes you more comfortable, and provide you with a safe room for the night. In the morning, when you've rested, we can discuss your situation further, but I need you to trust me for the next few hours. Can you do that?" It was insane. She'd just met him. He was a vampire, a literal monster, a thing that shouldn't exist outside of fiction. But something in his voice, in the careful way he maintained his distance, in the genuine anger she'd seen when he looked at her injuries, made Mira nod. She reached out and placed her bloody hand in his skin was cool to the touch, and his fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. "Good," Alexander said. "Let's get you taken care of." The next hours passed in a blur of activity that felt surreal compared to the violence of earlier. Alexander led her personally through the mansion to a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire apartment had been. All dark wood and deep red fabrics and windows with heavy curtains. A human doctor appeared, a kindly older man named Dr. Harrison, who asked no questions and treated her injuries with professional efficiency. 2 cracked ribs, as Alexander had guessed, along with severe bruising, multiple contusions, and lacerations on her feet that required careful cleaning and bandaging. The doctor left her with painkillers and instructions to rest, and then a woman appeared, another human, middle-aged, with kind eyes, carrying clean clothes and offering to help Mira bathe. Mira declined the help but accepted the clothes, and after the woman left, she spent 20 minutes in a bathroom that looked like something from a luxury hotel, crying under the spray of a shower that didn't smell like David's cologne. When she emerged, dressed in soft pajamas that actually fit her, Alexander was waiting in the suite sitting room. He stood by the window, one hand holding the curtain aside as he looked out into the darkness. He turned when she entered, and Mira saw his eyes scan her quickly, cataloging her cleaned wounds and fresh bandages. "Dr. Harrison says you'll recover fully, though it will take time." "Are you in much pain? The medicine helps." Mira hovered uncertainly in the doorway. "Thank you for all of this. You didn't have to." Yes, Alexander interrupted firmly. I did. You came to my territory seeking sanctuary. By the oldest laws of my people, that places you under my protection. He moved away from the window, settling into one of the armchairs and gesturing for her to take the other. Please sit, you must be exhausted. Mira was beyond exhausted, running on adrenaline and shock and painkillers. But she crossed the room and sank into the chair, which was so comfortable she almost whimpered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and fixed her with that intense crimson gaze. Tell me about your husband. Myra didn't want to relive it, didn't want to admit how stupid she'd been to stay for so long. But something about Alexander's expression, patient and attentive and genuinely interested, made the words spill out. She told him about meeting David 4 years ago, about how charming he'd been, how quickly they'd fallen in love, about the first time he'd grabbed her arm too hard, the first time he'd shoved her, the first time he'd hit her, about the escalation that happened so gradually she hadn't noticed until she was trapped. About tonight, when he'd come home drunk and angry about something at work and decided to take it out on her body. I broke his nose, Mira said, surprised by the hint of pride in her own voice. When he was kicking me, I finally fought back and broke his nose, and while he was cursing and bleeding, I just ran. Grabbed nothing. Just ran in my nightgown like some ridiculous damsel in distress. You survived, Alexander said quietly. That makes you considerably more than a damsel in distress. That makes you a warrior. Mira laughed, a broken sound. I'm not a warrior. I'm a woman who was too stupid to leave an abusive marriage until I almost died. You're a woman who survived 3 years of systematic torture and still found the strength to escape. Alexander's voice had taken on that edge of controlled fury again. Your husband is the stupid one and the weak one. Any male who raises his hand to his partner deserves nothing but contempt. Even if you're a vampire king? I assume you've killed people. Many, Alexander agreed without hesitation. I've lived for 432 years and I won't pretend to be a saint. But I've never harmed someone weaker than myself for the pleasure of it. I've never hurt someone who trusted me, and I've certainly never raised my hand to a woman in anger. He paused, studying her face. You're wondering why I care. Why I didn't simply let my guards turn you away, or worse. Mira nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise, because Alexander said slowly, 500 years ago, when I was still human, I watched my father beat my mother to death. I was 10 years old and too small to stop him. That night shaped everything I became afterward, both the man I tried to be and the vampire I eventually chose to become. So when my guards brought me a woman who ran barefoot and bleeding into my territory seeking sanctuary, there was only one possible response. You stay here as long as you need to. You have my protection, my resources, and my word that your husband will never touch you again. The certainty in his voice made Mira believe him, which was probably dangerous. What if he comes looking for me? Alexander's smile was cold and predatory. I sincerely hope he does. Despite everything, the pain, the fear, the insanity of her situation, Mira felt something in her chest unknot slightly. For the first time in 3 years, she felt safe. It wouldn't last, she knew. Nothing ever did. But for tonight, in this strange mansion surrounded by vampires and protected by an ancient king, she could rest. Thank you, she whispered. Alexander stood, moving toward the door. Sleep as late as you'd like. I'll have food brought up whenever you wake. And Mira? He paused in the doorway, looking back at her. You're not stupid. You're not weak. You're not any of the things I imagine he told you. Remember that. Then he was gone, and Mira was alone in a room that cost more than she'd made in a year, working her waitress job while David controlled all their finances. She should be terrified. She should be planning her escape. Instead, she crawled into the massive 4-poster bed, burrowed under covers that smelled like lavender, and slept more soundly than she had in years. When Mira woke, disoriented and aching, sunlight was streaming through gaps in the heavy curtains. She lay still for several minutes, piecing together where she was and what had happened. The vampire mansion, Alexander, her escape. It all felt like a fever dream, except her body's pain confirmed every moment had been real. She was struggling to sit up when there was a soft knock at the door. Come in, Mira called uncertainly. The kind-faced woman from last night entered, carrying a tray laden with food. Good afternoon, dear. I'm Margaret, the household manager. Lord Alexander asked me to bring you breakfast, lunch now, and to let you know he'd like to speak with you when you're feeling up to it. No rush, though. Afternoon? Mira glanced at the curtains again. What time is it? Nearly 2. You slept for almost 14 hours. Margaret set the tray on a side table and began opening curtains, flooding the room with natural light. Perfectly understandable, given what you've been through. How are you feeling? Sore, confused. Still not entirely sure this is real. Margaret's smile was sympathetic. It's real, I promise. I've worked for Lord Alexander for 15 years and I assure you you're quite safe here. Now eat up, and there are fresh clothes in the wardrobe. Take your time. He's a patient man. After Margaret left, Mira forced herself to eat despite her lack of appetite, then bathed again and dressed in the clothes provided, jeans and a soft sweater that fit her perfectly. Someone must have guessed her sizes. The thought should have been creepy, but after years with David, who'd never remembered her sizes or preferences or anything about her, it felt oddly touching. She found her way back to Alexander's study, following half-remembered turns and eventually just asking a passing guard who directed her politely. She knocked, heard that deep voice call for her to enter, and stepped inside. Alexander looked exactly as he had the night before, which made sense given he was literally immortal. He was reading something at his desk, and when he saw her, he immediately set it aside and stood. "Mira, good afternoon. Please sit. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck, but better than last night." Mira settled into one of the chairs before his desk. "Margaret said you wanted to talk?" "Yes. I've been doing some research this morning." Alexander's expression was serious as he resumed his seat. "Your husband is David Newton, 34, middle management at a tech company downtown. You've been married 3 years. You worked as a waitress at Romano's Italian restaurant. The house you lived in is owned by his parents. You have no family of your own in the state, no close friends, and your joint bank account is controlled solely by him." Mira felt her chest tighten. Hearing it laid out so clinically made it sound even worse. "How did you find all that out?" "I have resources." Alexander's tone was apologetic. "I needed to understand your situation to know how to best help you, and Mira, your situation is precarious. Legally, you have very few protections, you share no assets, you have no money of your own. And if your husband reports you missing, if he plays the concerned spouse, there's little preventing him from compelling you to return. I won't go back." Mira's voice came out harder than she intended. "I'll live on the streets first. I'll leave the state." You'll stay here," Alexander interrupted gently, "as my guest, for as long as you need. But I think we should also take steps to ensure your safety and independence long term. Would you like to hear my suggestions?" Mira nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "First, you need medical documentation of your injuries. Dr. Harrison has already prepared a full report which we can provide to the police if you wish to press charges. Second, you need a lawyer. I can connect you with one of the best family law attorneys in the city. She's familiar with my household and will ask no uncomfortable questions. Third, you need your own finances. I can provide you with employment here, legitimate work with a legitimate salary, so you have income independent of your husband. And fourth," he paused, his crimson eyes intense. "Fourth, I can make it very clear to your husband that pursuing you would be extremely unwise." "You mean threaten him?" "I mean ensure he understands that you are not alone and unprotected anymore. That if he comes near you again, there will be consequences." Alexander leaned forward. "I won't kill him unless he forces my hand. But I can be very persuasive when I choose to be." Mira thought about David's face the last time she'd seen it, twisted with rage and blood. Thought about the bruises he'd left, the ribs he'd cracked, the 3 years of walking on eggshells and making herself small, and wondering what she'd done to deserve this. "Okay," she said. "Yes, all of that, whatever it takes to make sure I never have to go back." Alexander's expression softened with something that might have been approval. "Good. I'll make the arrangements. In the meantime, would you like a tour of the grounds? I think you'll find the estate is quite secure, and it might ease your mind to see exactly where you are." The tour took the better part of the afternoon, and Mira's mind reeled trying to process it all. The mansion was even larger than she'd realized, with over 100 rooms spread across 4 floors and 2 underground levels. Most of the upper floors were living quarters for Alexander's household, a mix of vampires and human staff, all of whom treated her with careful courtesy. The ground floor held formal spaces like the study, a massive library, a ballroom that hadn't been used in decades, and a dining hall with a table that could seat 40 people. The underground levels were more utilitarian: storage, security systems, and what Alexander referred to as sleeping chambers for vampires who preferred to rest in rooms without windows. The grounds were equally impressive: 20 acres of gardens, courtyards, and wooded paths, all surrounded by that high stone wall. Alexander explained that the property had been in his family since they'd immigrated from Russia in the late 1800s, and that it was protected by a combination of modern security and old vampire magic that kept unwanted visitors out. "The gates opened for you," Alexander said as they walked through a rose garden that shouldn't be blooming in October but was anyway, "because you posed no threat, and because you were genuinely seeking sanctuary. The estate's protections recognize intent. Your husband could stand outside those gates and scream himself hoarse, and they would never open for him. Because his intent would be to hurt me." "Precisely." Mira stopped walking, looking up at the mansion in the fading afternoon light. "This is insane. A week ago I didn't believe vampires existed. Now I'm living in a vampire king's mansion while he protects me from my abusive husband. It's like something out of a book." Alexander stopped beside her, his expression thoughtful. "I've lived through enough human history to know that reality is often stranger than fiction, and for what it's worth, you're handling this remarkably well. Most humans who discover our existence react with considerably more panic. I think I'm too tired to panic properly." Mira turned to face him. "Can I ask you something? Last night you said you became a vampire by choice. How does that work? Most vampires are turned against their will or turned as they're dying. I was different." Alexander's gaze grew distant as if looking back across centuries. "I was 28 years old, a soldier in a war I didn't believe in, dying slowly from wounds that wouldn't heal. A vampire found me and offered me a choice: die as a human or live as a vampire. I chose to live. Some days I regret that choice. Most days I don't. Do you miss it, being human?" "I miss sunlight," Alexander admitted. "I miss the taste of food. Vampires can't digest it properly, though we can drink liquids other than blood. I miss the simplicity of a human lifespan, of knowing you have a finite time to make your mark. But I don't miss the weakness, the vulnerability, the constant knowledge that any injury, any illness, any accident could end everything in an instant." Mira thought about that, about trading humanity for power and immortality. "Does that make me weak then? That I'm still human?" "No." Alexander's answer was immediate and firm. "Humanity is not weakness. The fact that you have a finite lifespan makes your courage more impressive, not less. You stood up to someone who wanted to destroy you, knowing you could die. That's not weakness. That's extraordinary strength." Something in his tone made Mira's heart beat faster. She looked up at him, at his pale, perfect face and those impossible crimson eyes, and realized with a start that she was attracted to him. Not just grateful, not just awed by his power, but genuinely attracted. The thought was terrifying and absurd and deeply inconvenient, so she pushed it away and changed the subject. "You mentioned employment earlier. What kind of work did you have in mind?" Alexander seemed to understand that she needed to move away from the intensity of the conversation, because he smoothly shifted gears. "My library needs cataloging. The previous librarian retired 5 years ago, and the collection becomes somewhat disorganized. It's a massive undertaking, tens of thousands of books, many of them rare or ancient. I need someone to create a proper database, organize the physical collection, and handle acquisition of new materials. It would be perfect for someone who needs flexible hours and a safe work environment, and the salary would be substantial. I don't have a library science degree. You have a bachelor's in English literature and you work part-time at your college library." At Mira's surprised look, Alexander shrugged. "I was thorough in my research. You're qualified for what I need, and frankly, I trust you more than I'd trust bringing in a stranger, so. Are you interested?" It was a lifeline, a way to build something of her own while staying protected. "Yes," Mira said. "Absolutely yes." They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing logistics, and by the time dusk fell, and Alexander had to leave to attend to what he vaguely termed vampire business, Mira felt like she had a plan for the first time since she'd run. She would press charges against David with the help of the lawyer Alexander connected her with. She would file for divorce. She would work in the library and save money, and eventually, when she was ready, she would figure out what came next. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly David would retaliate. 3 days after Mira arrived at the estate, 2 police officers showed up at the gates asking questions. Alexander spoke to them personally, and Mira watched from a window as he handed over documentation and spoke with calm authority. The officers left and Alexander returned to where she waited in the library, his expression dark. "Your husband filed a missing persons report. He told the police that you've been struggling with mental health issues and that he's worried you've been taken advantage of by a predatory stranger." Alexander's voice dripped with contempt. "He's playing the concerned husband to perfection." Mira felt sick. "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that you're here of your own free will, that you've made a statement about domestic abuse, and that you're currently considering your legal options. I provided them with Dr. Harrison's medical report and the contact information for the attorney I've retained on your behalf. They have no grounds to compel you to leave or to speak with your husband. But Mira, you need to understand he's not going to let this go quietly. I know." Mira wrapped her arms around herself, standing among the towering shelves of books that had become her sanctuary over the past few days. "He can't stand losing control. He'll escalate. Then we'll be ready." Alexander moved closer, and Mira was becoming accustomed to his presence, the cool temperature of his skin, the predatory grace of his movements, the sense of barely contained power that radiated from him. "I've increased security around the estate. If he approaches the gates, we'll know. And I've taken the liberty of having one of my people deliver a message to him." "What kind of message?" Alexander's smile was cold. The kind that makes it clear that his wife is under the protection of someone considerably more dangerous than him, and that further attempts to contact or harass you will be met with swift and severe consequences. You threatened him. I had him threatened. There's a distinction. Alexander's expression softened as he looked at her. I won't apologize for it. He hurt you. He intended to continue hurting you. He deserves to be afraid. Mira should have felt guilty about that, about using Alexander's power to frighten David. But all she felt was a savage satisfaction. Good, she said. I hope he's terrified. Over the following weeks, Mira settled into a routine that felt increasingly surreal. She spent her days in the library, working through the massive collection and creating detailed catalogs. The work was absorbing and peaceful, requiring enough concentration that she could lose herself in it for hours. Margaret checked on her regularly, bringing meals and making sure she was comfortable. Dr. Harrison visited twice to examine her healing injuries. The human staff treated her like any other member of the household, and the vampire residents gave her respectful distance while making it clear she was welcome. And Alexander was there, a constant presence that Mira found herself looking forward to more than she should. He worked odd hours, often handling vampire business late into the night, but he made a point of spending time with her most evenings. Sometimes he'd sit in the library while she worked, reading or dealing with correspondence. Sometimes they'd have dinner together. Mira would eat while Alexander drank wine and kept her company. They talked about everything and nothing: her favorite books, his memories of centuries past, the politics of vampire society, her dreams for what came next. Mira was fascinated by glimpses into his world. The vampire territories were organized like nations, with kings and queens ruling different regions. Alexander governed all of North America, but he answered to an international council of elder vampires. There were laws about feeding, about turning humans, about revealing vampire existence to the broader world. It was complex and formal and utterly alien, but Alexander explained it all with patient detail whenever she asked. Do you have to kill people to feed? Mira asked one evening, sprawled in one of the library's reading chairs while Alexander sat across from her. No, we can drink from humans without killing them. It's actually considered a mark of control to feed without taking too much. Most vampires in civilized territories have agreements with willing donors, humans who provide blood in exchange for compensation. I have several such arrangements, but I won't pretend vampires don't kill. Some do, either out of hunger or cruelty or poor impulse control. It's why we have laws to limit the damage and prevent exposure. Have you killed people? Yes. Alexander didn't flinch from the question. In wars, in self-defense, and occasionally as punishment for crimes against my people. I'm not a good man by human standards, Mira. I'm a predator who's learned to live by rules that allow both species to coexist. But I am a man of my word, and I protect what's mine. The way he said mine made heat pool in Mira's stomach. She was increasingly aware that her feelings for Alexander were growing beyond gratitude or friendship. She thought about him constantly, looked forward to their conversations, noticed details like the way his hair fell across his shoulders or how his rare genuine smiles transformed his face. It was absurd and dangerous, and she had no idea if he felt anything similar, but she couldn't seem to stop. The attraction became harder to ignore as October turned to November and Mira's physical injuries healed. The lawyer Alexander had connected her with was efficient and ruthless, filing for divorce and a restraining order simultaneously. David's lawyer tried to fight it, but the medical evidence was damning, and David's own police statement about Mira's mental health issues contradicted his later claims that everything had been fine in their marriage. The legal process would take months, but Mira's lawyer was confident about the outcome. David himself tried to contact Mira multiple times, calls to the estate that were politely deflected, emails that went unanswered, one attempt to approach the gates that ended with him being escorted away by two of Alexander's largest guards. According to Margaret, who heard about it from the guards, David had been pale and shaking by the end of the encounter. Good, Mira thought viciously. Let him know what fear feels like, but David's harassment took its toll on her nerves. She started having nightmares about him breaking into the estate, about him finding her, about him dragging her back to that house with a yellow porch light. She'd wake gasping and terrified, and twice she woke up screaming. The second time, Alexander appeared in her room within seconds, moving with that impossible vampire speed. He'd been in his own chambers 3 floors away, but he'd heard her and come immediately. You're safe, he said, keeping his distance but his voice firm and grounding. You're in my house, under my protection. He can't reach you here. I know, Mira gasped, clutching her blankets. I know, but I keep dreaming. Tell me. Alexander moved closer, settling carefully on the edge of her bed. Tell me what you dream, so Mira told him. All the terrible scenarios her traumatized brain conjured in sleep, and Alexander listened, his crimson eyes never leaving her face until she ran out of words. Then he did something that surprised her. He reached out and took her hand, his cool fingers lacing through hers. "I cannot stop your nightmares," he said quietly, "but I can promise you this: your husband will never touch you again. If he breaches this estate, he will not leave it alive. If he tries to take you legally, I will ensure you have resources to fight him. And if he somehow manages to get to you despite all my precautions, I will hunt him to the ends of the earth and ensure he regrets the day he was born. You are under my protection, Mira. That is not a casual phrase. It is an oath backed by 4 centuries of power. Do you understand?" Mira nodded, tears streaming down her face. Not from fear this time, but from overwhelming relief. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Because you deserve to be protected. Because I've lived too long to stand by while someone vulnerable is hurt. And because," he stopped, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because in the weeks since you arrived, you've become important to me. More important than is perhaps wise." Mira's heart hammered in her chest. "What does that mean?" "It means I find myself thinking about you at inappropriate times. It means I look forward to our evenings together more than I should. It means that when your husband tried to approach the gates, it took considerable restraint not to simply kill him on the spot." Alexander's eyes met hers, and in them Mira saw something she'd never expected: uncertainty. "I am 432 years old. You are 26. You've just escaped a traumatic situation, and I am your protector. Any feelings between us would be complicated by power imbalances that I cannot ignore. But I won't lie to you. I care for you, Mira, deeply." Mira's breath caught. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that this was too fast, too complicated, that she needed time to heal before even thinking about another relationship. But another part, the part that had been drawn to Alexander from the first night, was singing with joy. "I care about you too," she admitted. "I have for weeks. I just didn't think. I mean, you're a vampire king and I'm a mess of a human, and you," Alexander interrupted, his free hand coming up to cup her face with infinite gentleness, "are the strongest person I've met in decades. Human or vampire, and if you'll allow it, I would very much like to court you properly. Slowly, with no pressure and no expectations. Just the opportunity to see if what's growing between us could become something real." Mira leaned into his touch, his skin cool against her tear-stained cheek. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." Alexander smiled, a real smile that made him look almost boyish despite his ancient eyes. "Good. Then sleep, and in the morning we'll begin." He stayed with her for the rest of the night, sitting in the chair by her bed and keeping watch. Mira fell asleep holding his hand, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, she didn't have nightmares. Their courtship was unlike anything Mira had experienced. Alexander approached it with the formality of someone from another century, asking permission before every touch, planning elaborate dates that ranged from stargazing on the mansion's roof to private concerts in the ballroom. He gave her books from his collection, rare first editions, with inscriptions in his elegant handwriting. He listened when she talked about her day, asked thoughtful questions, and never once made her feel like her interests were less important than his centuries of experience. And slowly, carefully, they grew closer. Hand-holding became casual touches, became careful kisses that left Mira breathless. Alexander was always conscious of her past, always checking in, always making sure she was comfortable. It was so different from David's possessive demands that sometimes Mira wanted to cry from sheer relief. "You can say no," Alexander told her one evening when they were kissing in the library and his hand had drifted to her waist. "At any time, for any reason. I will never push you, never pressure you. Your consent matters more than my desires." "I know," Mira said, and she did. It was one of the things she loved about him, his careful respect, his willingness to let her set the pace. "But Alexander, I don't want to say no right now." His eyes darkened with want, but he still asked, "Are you certain?" "I'm certain." What followed was a study in patience and care, Alexander making love to her like she was something precious, checking in constantly, making sure she was present and happy. It was healing in a way Mira hadn't expected, replacing bad memories with good ones, proving that intimacy could be mutual and joyful, rather than something to endure. Afterward, lying tangled together in her bed, Alexander kissed her forehead and murmured, "I love you. I should probably wait to say that, but I'm 4 centuries old and I've learned not to waste time on pretense." "I love you, Mira Novak." "I love you too," Mira whispered back, and meant it with her entire being, but their happiness couldn't exist in isolation forever. In mid-December, Mira's lawyer called with news David had violated the restraining order. He'd been arrested after trying to approach Mira's workplace, the estate, and making threats. He was currently in jail awaiting bail, but once released, there was no guarantee he wouldn't try again. "He's escalating," the lawyer said over the phone while Mira sat in Alexander's study, The Vampire King listening on speaker. I've filed for additional protections, but Ms. Novik, you need to be very careful. Men like your husband don't handle rejection well, and the fact that you've moved on so publicly. What does that mean? Mira asked sharply. The lawyer hesitated. There are photos online of you and Mr. Voronin. Someone took them a few weeks ago when you were at that outdoor concert. They've been circulating on social media, and your husband has seen them. His lawyer mentioned it in court, claiming you abandoned the marriage for another man. Mira felt sick. She'd been so careful to stay on the estate grounds, but that one event, a violin concert in a public park that Alexander had arranged for her, had been off the property. And now David knew. Not just that she'd left him, but that she'd found someone else. What do we do? She asked after the lawyer hung up. Alexander's expression was grim. We prepare for the possibility that he'll try something drastic. I'm going to have guards with you whenever you leave the estate, and I'm going to contact some associates who can ensure your husband understands the consequences of his actions. Alexander, I won't kill him unless he forces my hand, Alexander said, anticipating her concern. But I can make his life very difficult, financially, professionally, socially. Men like him respond to power, and I have considerable power to bring to bear. Over the next week, Alexander made good on that promise. David lost his job after Alexander had a quiet word with the company's CEO, who happened to owe the Vampire King a favor. David's parents suddenly decided their son couldn't continue living in their rental property. David's friends received visits from very intimidating people who suggested that continuing to associate with someone who'd abused his wife was poor judgment. It was ruthless and thorough, and Mira knew she should probably feel guilty about it. She didn't. But David, cornered and desperate and humiliated, did exactly what Mira feared he would. He came to the estate on a December night when snow was falling and the gates gleamed with ice. He didn't try to talk his way past the guards. He simply rammed his truck through the gates, breaching the wards through sheer reckless force. Alarms blared immediately. Mira was in the library when it happened, and Alexander was beside her within seconds, having moved with that preternatural speed. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone except me or Margaret. Do you understand? Alexander, do you understand?" His crimson eyes blazed with fury and fear, and Mira realized he was terrified for her. "I understand." He kissed her hard and fast, then was gone. Mira locked the door with shaking hands and backed away into the stacks, her phone clutched in one hand. She could hear shouting from outside, raised voices and sounds of a struggle. Then, horrifyingly, a gunshot. Mira's heart stopped. Vampires could be killed, she'd learned that much. Stake through the heart, decapitation, or enough damage that their bodies couldn't regenerate. A gun wouldn't kill Alexander, but it could hurt him, and the thought of him injured because of her was unbearable. Minutes passed like hours. Mira stood frozen among the books, listening to silence that seemed to stretch forever. Then footsteps approaching the library door, and a knock. "It's me," Alexander's voice. Mira rushed to the door, throwing it open. Alexander stood in the hallway, looking disheveled and angry but uninjured. Behind him, two of his guards held David between them. Her husband, ex-husband, she reminded herself fiercely, looked terrible. His face was bruised, his clothes torn, and he was staring at Alexander with naked terror. "I thought you might want to see this," Alexander said quietly, his eyes on Mira. "But if you'd rather not, I want to see it." Mira stepped forward, meeting David's gaze. Her husband flinched. "Mira, please," David said, his voice cracking. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean, I just wanted to talk. I love you. We can work this out." It was the same speech he'd given her dozens of times before after every incident, the same manipulation that had kept her trapped for years. But standing here, with Alexander beside her and the full resources of the Vampire King behind her, Mira felt nothing but contempt. "No," she said clearly, "we can't. You hurt me, David. You terrorized me. You broke my ribs and split my lip and made me afraid in my own home. And then, when I finally escaped, you couldn't let go. You violated a restraining order. You broke into private property. You brought a gun to a fight with a Vampire King because you'd rather see me dead than happy without you. So no, we're not working this out. We're done. Forever." David's face twisted with rage, the mask of contrition dropping. "You're a whore," he spat. "You left me for this freak and you think that makes you better than me? You're nothing, Mira. You've always been nothing." Alexander moved so fast Mira barely saw it. One moment he was beside her, the next he had David by the throat, lifting him off the ground. The guards stepped back, releasing their hold. David choked and clawed at Alexander's hand, his feet kicking uselessly. "You will never," Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet, "speak to her like that again. You will never speak to her at all. You will accept the divorce, accept the consequences of your actions, and you will disappear from her life permanently. If I hear that you've attempted to contact her, If I hear that you've spoken her name, if I even hear that you've thought about her too long, I will end you. Not quickly, not mercifully. I will make you wish you'd died tonight. Do we have an understanding?" David's face was purple, his eyes bulging. He managed a jerky nod. Alexander dropped him and he crumpled to the floor, gasping. The Vampire King looked at his guards. "Get him off my property. Take him to the police and have him charged with trespassing, property destruction, and assault. Make sure they understand he was carrying a weapon and intended harm." The guards hauled David to his feet and dragged him away. Mira stood frozen, watching until he disappeared around a corner. Then she started shaking, reaction setting in. Alexander caught her as her knees buckled, lifting her easily and carrying her to a couch in the library's reading area. "I'm sorry," he murmured, kneeling before her and taking her hands. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I should have simply had the guards handle it, but I thought you might need closure." "I did," Mira managed. "I needed to see him powerless. I needed to tell him it was over." She laughed shakily. "I just didn't expect to feel so much all at once." "You're safe now," Alexander said, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "He's going to prison for a long time, and even if he somehow gets out, I'll make sure he's never a threat again." "It's over, Mira. Truly over." It was. Mira felt it settle into her bones, the knowledge that this chapter of her life was finally closed. David was no longer her problem. She was free. "I love you," she whispered to Alexander. "Thank you for everything, for taking me in, for protecting me, for helping me find myself again." "I love you too," Alexander replied. "And you don't need to thank me. You saved yourself the night you ran. I just provided the safe harbor you needed to land." The weeks after David's arrest passed in a blur of legal proceedings and healing. David was sentenced to 18 months in prison for the various charges, and the divorce was finalized without further contest. Mira legally changed her name back to her maiden name, opened her own bank accounts, and slowly began to reclaim pieces of her identity she'd lost during the marriage. Christmas came, and Alexander surprised her with a trip to the estate's extensive wine cellar, not to drink, but because he'd converted a section of it into a private art gallery featuring works by artists Mira loved. They spent hours down there, Mira exclaiming over paintings she'd only seen in books while Alexander watched her with fond amusement. "You knew all my favorites," she said, stunned. "You mentioned them over the months," Alexander replied. "I listen when you talk, beloved." New Year's Eve, they stood on the mansion's roof and watched fireworks over the distant city. Mira was wrapped in furs against the cold while Alexander, who didn't feel temperature the same way, stood beside her in just a jacket. "What do you want from this year?" Alexander asked as midnight approached. Mira considered. 6 months ago she'd been trapped and terrified, unable to imagine a future beyond survival. Now she stood beside a vampire king who loved her, living in a mansion full of people who'd become family, doing work she found meaningful. She'd come so far, but there was still further to go. "I want to keep healing," she said finally. "I want to finish cataloging your library. I want to learn more about your world, about vampire culture and history and politics. And I want to keep falling in love with you every day." Alexander pulled her close, and she tilted her face up for his kiss as fireworks exploded overhead. "All of that sounds perfect," he murmured against her lips. "Though I should warn you, vampire politics is remarkably dull. I'll risk it." January brought an unexpected visitor. Mira was working in the library when Margaret came to find her, looking flustered. "There's a woman at the gates. A vampire. She says she's Lord Alexander's sister and that she needs to speak with him urgently." Alexander's sister. He'd mentioned siblings occasionally, but Mira hadn't realized any of them were still alive, or undead, rather. She found Alexander in his study, already pulling on a formal jacket. His expression was tense. "I wasn't expecting her," he said. "Svetlana rarely visits unless something's wrong. Stay here. Vampire family politics can be vicious." But Mira had had enough of being protected from difficult things. "I'm coming with you. If she's important to you, I want to meet her." Alexander looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Mira's expression stopped him. "All right, but stay close to me, and if I tell you to leave, you leave immediately. Agreed?" "Agreed." Svetlana Voronin was waiting in the formal parlor, and she was stunning. Where Alexander was tall and imposing, she was delicate and ethereal, with the same white hair and skin but eyes that were a pale blue rather than crimson. She wore a modern designer dress that probably cost more than Mira made in a year, and she radiated power that made the hair on Mira's arms stand up. "Brother," Svetlana said, rising gracefully. Then her eyes landed on Mira, and her expression shifted to surprise. "And this must be the human I've been hearing about." "This is Mira," Alexander said, his hand settling protectively on the small of Mira's back. "My partner, Mira, my sister Svetlana." Partner, not girlfriend, not guest, partner. Mira tried not to show how much that word meant to her. "It's nice to meet you." "Likewise." Svetlana studied Mira with unnerving intensity. You're the woman who ran into my brother's territory seeking sanctuary, the one he's been protecting from an abusive human male, the one who's apparently captured his heart after 4 centuries of carefully maintained distance from romantic entanglements. Svetlana, Alexander said warningly. I'm not criticizing. Svetlana's smile was sharp. I'm actually impressed. It takes remarkable courage to run into vampire territory, and even more to stand before me without trembling. You have spine, Mira. I appreciate that, thank you. Mira wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a threat. It is both, Svetlana said, which suggested she could read body language terrifyingly well. But I didn't come here to intimidate your human, Alexander. I came because the council is asking questions about her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. What kind of questions? Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The kind that come when a vampire king takes a human partner openly in defiance of traditional protocol. There are concerns about security, about exposure, about the precedent you're setting. Svetlana's expression was sympathetic but firm. You know how conservative the Elder Council is. They're demanding you either turn her or end the relationship. Myra felt like she'd been punched. Turn her. Make her a vampire. She looked at Alexander, who looked absolutely furious. The council, he said with icy precision, can make all the demands they want. I am king of this territory, and whom I choose as my partner is my business alone. Mira will remain human unless and until she chooses otherwise, and our relationship will continue regardless of what the council thinks about it. I expected you'd say that, Svetlana sighed. Which is why I came to warn you. They're sending an envoy next month to evaluate the situation. You'll need to present a united front, prove that Mira isn't a security risk, and make it clear that your judgment hasn't been compromised by human emotions. My judgment is sound. I know that. You know that. But the council is made up of vampires who remember when humans were food and nothing more. They don't understand partnership with mortals, and they're afraid of change. Svetlana looked at Mira again. Can you handle being scrutinized by ancient vampires who will be looking for any excuse to declare you unfit? Mira's first instinct was to say no, to run, to remove herself from the situation so Alexander didn't suffer consequences because of her. But she'd spent 3 years making herself small to appease David, and she was done with that. Yes, she said firmly. I can handle it. I won't let them intimidate me, and I won't let them use me against Alexander. Svetlana's smile became genuine. Good, you really do have spine. She turned back to her brother. I'll send you information on the council members who'll be visiting. Study their preferences, prepare your arguments, and for the love of all things unholy, make sure your household presents a unified image. If they sense any instability, they'll use it against you. After Svetlana left, Alexander pulled Mira into his arms, holding her tightly. I'm sorry, he murmured into her hair. I knew there would eventually be questions, but I didn't think the council would move this quickly. You shouldn't have to face this kind of scrutiny. It's fine, Mira said, though her heart was racing. I knew being with you would be complicated. I just didn't realize vampire politics involved quite so much bureaucracy. Alexander laughed despite himself. It's worse than human politics, honestly. Centuries of grudges and complex alliances and formal protocols that haven't been updated since the Renaissance. So what do? We prepare. We present you as intelligent, capable, and an asset to my household. We demonstrate that you understand the risks of our world and have adapted well. And we make it very clear that I will not be ordered about like a subordinate. Alexander pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. But Mira, you need to understand what you're walking into. These vampires are ancient and powerful. They will try to undermine you, to find weaknesses, to prove you're not suitable. It won't be pleasant. I survived 3 years with David, Mira said quietly. I can survive some snobbish vampires questioning my relationship choices. That's my brave girl. Alexander kissed her forehead. We'll face this together. The next month was intensive preparation. Alexander taught Mira about vampire history, politics, and protocol. She learned to recognize the formal gestures of respect, the subtle power dynamics in conversation, the way to address different ranks of vampire nobility. She studied the council members who'd be visiting 3 ancient vampires named Lucian, Morgana, and Cassius, each over 1,000 years old and deeply conservative. She also spent time with the other residents of the estate, both vampire and human, building relationships and understanding how the household functioned. It was important, Alexander explained, that the council saw her as integrated into his world rather than a temporary distraction. The night the council members arrived, Mira wore a formal gown that Alexander had commissioned for her deep burgundy, with delicate beading that caught the light. She'd styled her hair up, and she wore a necklace that Alexander had given her, a ruby pendant that had belonged to his human mother centuries ago. She looked the part of a vampire king's partner, and she was determined to act it too. The council members were exactly as intimidating as she'd feared. Lucian was tall and severe, with features like carved ice. Morgana was elegant and ancient, her movement suggesting she'd been a predator when Rome was young. Cassius had the bearing of a military commander, assessing everything with strategic precision. All three looked at Mira like she was a potentially dangerous anomaly requiring careful study. The formal dinner was excruciating. Mira sat beside Alexander at the head of the table while the council members asked probing questions disguised as polite conversation. How had she come to be in Alexander's household? Did she understand the risks of exposure to vampire society? What were her long-term intentions regarding the relationship? Was she aware that human lifespans were insignificant compared to vampire immortality? Mira answered each question carefully, aware that her every word was being analyzed. She was honest about her circumstances, the abuse, the escape, Alexander's protection. She acknowledged the challenges of the relationship but emphasized her commitment. And when Morgana asked pointedly about mortality, Mira looked her straight in her ancient eyes and said, "I'm aware that I'll grow old and die while Alexander remains young. But I'd rather have 50 meaningful years with him than an eternity without him. Love isn't less valuable because it's finite." Something shifted in the room. Lucian's severe expression softened slightly. Morgana actually looked impressed, and Cassius nodded approvingly. "You love him," Morgana said. "It wasn't a question." "More than I thought I could love anyone," Mira replied. "And you," Lucian said, turning to Alexander, "love her." "With everything I am," Alexander said simply, his hand finding Mira's under the table. The council members exchanged glances, having some silent conversation that Mira couldn't follow. Then Morgana spoke, her voice formal. "We have concerns about security and exposure, but we acknowledge that partnership between species is not unprecedented in our history. If Lord Alexander is confident in his judgment, and if Lady Mira continues to demonstrate discretion and integration into vampire society, we are prepared to accept this relationship." However, her eyes fixed on Mira. "Should you choose to become one of us, the process will require council approval and oversight. We cannot have inexperienced vampires turned carelessly, regardless of their human connections." It was a backhanded victory, but a victory nonetheless. Mira let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "I understand, thank you." The rest of the evening passed more smoothly, and by the time the council members left 3 days later, Mira felt like she'd passed some sort of elaborate test. Alexander certainly seemed relieved, pulling her into his arms the moment they were alone. "You were magnificent," he said. Confident, articulate, completely unintimidated. Even Lucian was impressed, and he's never impressed by humans. "I was terrified the entire time," Mira admitted. "You didn't show it, that's what matters." Alexander kissed her thoroughly. "You've been officially accepted as my partner by the council. That means protection under vampire law, certain privileges within our society, and the understanding that anyone who threatens you answers to me and to the council. You're safe, beloved. Truly safe." Mira hadn't realized how much tension she'd been carrying until it released. She was safe, protected not just by Alexander's personal power but by the formal recognition of vampire society. David was in prison and would remain there for months yet. She had work she loved, a home that felt like her own, and a relationship that made her happier than she'd ever been. "I love you," she said, pulling Alexander down for another kiss. "Thank you for fighting for us." "Always," Alexander promised. "For as long as you'll have me." Spring came slowly to the estate, snow giving way to early flowers in the gardens. Mira celebrated her 27th birthday with a small party that included Margaret, Dr. Harrison, several of the guards who'd become friends, and of course Alexander. It was simple and warm and nothing like the tense, performative birthdays she'd endured with David. Summer brought new challenges. Alexander had to travel to handle vampire business in other territories, and Mira went with him. They visited a vampire court in New Orleans, elegant and decadent and utterly surreal. They spent a week in a centuries-old stronghold in the mountains of Colorado, where Alexander negotiated treaties with a clan of vampires who viewed him with cautious respect. Mira got to see a side of Alexander she'd only heard about: the king, the politician, the warrior who'd held power for centuries. It was intimidating and impressive and made her fall in love with him all over again. Fall returned, marking a full year since Mira had run barefoot and bleeding into vampire territory. She was standing in the library one October evening, surrounded by the meticulously organized collection she'd spent the year cataloging, when Alexander found her. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Just thinking about how much has changed." Mira leaned back against him. "A year ago I was running for my life with no plan and no hope. Now I'm here, with you, living a life I couldn't have imagined. It feels like a fairy tale sometimes. Even though you're in love with a vampire, especially because I'm in love with a vampire." Mira turned in his arms to face him. "You saved my life, Alexander. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. You helped me remember who I was and become who I wanted to be. You gave me safety and space and love. I don't have words for how grateful I am. You saved yourself, Alexander said, echoing his words from that first terrible night. I just provided the safe harbor, and as for love that was inevitable. You're remarkable, Mira. How could I not love you? They stood there in the library, surrounded by centuries of collected knowledge, and Mira knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. Not despite the strangeness of it all, but because of it. She'd run into vampire territory seeking sanctuary, and she'd found a home. Alexander? She said softly. Ask me. He pulled back slightly, studying her face. Ask you what? The question I know you've been thinking about for months, the one you're too considerate to bring up because you don't want to pressure me. Mira smiled. Ask me if I want forever with you. Alexander's expression shifted through surprise, hope, and fear in quick succession. Mira, turning is not something to take lightly. You'd lose sunlight, human food, the ability to have children if you wanted them. You'd lose your mortality, your chance to live a normal human life. I can't ask that of you. I'm not asking you to ask. I'm telling you that I've thought about it, carefully and seriously, for months. And I've decided. Mira took his hands in hers. I want forever with you, Alexander. I want centuries of late-night conversations and new adventures and learning everything there is to know about your world. I want to stand beside you as your equal, not your protected mortal. I want to be turned if you'll do it. Are you certain? Alexander's voice was raw with emotion. Once done, it cannot be undone. You would be vampire forever. I'm certain. Mira had never been more certain of anything. I'm not running away from humanity, I'm running toward a future with you. There's a difference. Alexander pulled her close, and Mira felt him trembling slightly. Then yes, he whispered. Yes, I'll turn you. But we'll do it properly, with the council's approval and preparation and every precaution. I won't risk you. I know you won't. Mira kissed him. That's why I trust you with this. The turning process took months of preparation, as Alexander had promised. There were meetings with the council, medical evaluations to ensure Mira was healthy enough for the transformation, and extensive education about what to expect. Vampire turning was a 3-day process of death and rebirth, painful and dangerous, with a small but real risk of failure. Mira would need to be in perfect health, and she'd need Alexander's blood repeatedly to complete the transformation. The council approved her turning in December, almost exactly a year after they'd first visited. Morgana herself oversaw the preparations, treating Mira with a respect that felt hard-won but genuine. You understand what you're giving up, Morgana said during one of their final meetings. It wasn't a question, but Mira answered anyway. I understand, but I also understand what I'm gaining. I'm not doing this lightly, but I'm doing it willingly. Then you'll make an excellent addition to our ranks. Morgana's smile was approving. Few humans have the strength to choose this path with full knowledge of its costs. They scheduled the turning for early January, giving Mira time to say goodbye to the sun. She spent her last days as a human doing things she'd miss, eating her favorite foods, taking long walks in winter sunlight, video calling with her few human friends to let them know she'd be traveling extensively for the foreseeable future. It was bittersweet but not sad. She was ready. The turning itself was every bit as difficult as promised. Alexander drained her to the point of death, then gave her his blood to drink. She died in his arms as the sun rose on January 15th, and for 3 days she existed in a strange twilight state, her body remaking itself cell by cell. Alexander never left her side, providing blood and comfort and reassurance when the pain became unbearable. On the 3rd day, Mira woke up different. The world looked sharper, colors more vivid. She could hear conversations happening rooms away, smell the specific blend of oils in the furniture polish. And when she looked at Alexander, she could see the thread of blood that connected them, the bond between maker and fledgling. How do you feel? He asked, his voice soft. Mira took inventory. Stronger, faster, more alert than she'd ever been. And hungry, God, she was so hungry. Like I could run for miles without getting tired, and like I desperately need to eat something. Alexander smiled. That would be the blood hunger. Let's get you fed, and then we'll start your training properly. You have a lot to learn about being a vampire. He wasn't wrong. The first months of vampire existence were a crash course in self-control and new abilities. Mira had to learn to manage her strength so she didn't accidentally break things. She had to learn to feed from willing donors without taking too much. She had to learn the protocols and politics of vampire society from the inside. It was overwhelming and exhilarating and occasionally frustrating, but Alexander was patient, and the household supported her completely. By spring, Mira had adjusted to her new existence. She could walk through the world confidently as a vampire, managing her hunger and her abilities. She continued her work in the library, now able to read for days without fatigue, and her relationship with Alexander deepened into something that felt eternal in truth, not just in promise. They were married in a ceremony that blended vampire tradition with human elements, witnessed by both the household and representatives from the council. Svetlana stood as Alexander's witness, and Margaret stood for Mira, both women beaming. It was small and intimate and perfect, and when Alexander kissed his new wife, Mira felt like everything in her life had led to this moment. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," Alexander replied. "For now and for always." Time moved differently for vampires, Mira discovered. Days blurred into weeks, months into years. But she and Alexander filled those years with meaning, traveling the world, learning new skills, building a life that was rich and full. They visited ancient vampire courts in Europe, explored hidden societies in Asia, and returned always to their estate in Seattle, where the household welcomed them home. Myra never forgot where she'd come from. She worked with organizations that supported domestic violence survivors, using her resources and position to help other women escape dangerous situations. She funded shelters and legal aid programs. She became an advocate, using her voice to speak for those who couldn't yet speak for themselves. It was her way of honoring the terrified woman who'd run barefoot into vampire territory, trusting that somewhere in the darkness there might be salvation, and there had been. Not just salvation, but transformation. Not just escape, but a future more wonderful than she'd ever imagined. She'd run seeking sanctuary and found a home. She'd been broken and found healing. She'd expected to survive and instead learned to thrive. 10 years after that first terrible night, Mira stood in the gardens of the estate with Alexander, watching the stars wheel overhead. They'd just returned from a trip to Japan, where they'd spent months studying with a vampire scholar who was teaching Mira the finer points of supernatural diplomacy. She'd proven to be talented at it, and Alexander was quietly proud of how his wife had become a respected figure in vampire society in her own right. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked softly. "Giving up your humanity?" Mira considered the question seriously. She missed sunlight sometimes, missed the taste of coffee and chocolate, missed the simplicity of a mortal lifespan. But when she weighed those losses against what she'd gained centuries with the man she loved, the chance to make a real difference, a life filled with wonder and purpose, there was no contest. "Never," she said firmly. "This life with you is everything I ever wanted, even when I didn't know I could want it." Alexander pulled her close and they stood there in the darkness, two immortals who'd found each other against impossible odds. Mira thought about the woman she'd been terrified, bleeding, running through unfamiliar streets with no plan beyond escape. That woman had been so brave, choosing the unknown over certain destruction, and she'd been rewarded beyond measure. The guards hadn't stopped her that night. The gates had opened as if they'd been waiting, and Alexander had invited her in, not knowing that in doing so he was inviting in the love of his very long life. It had all been chance or fate or just the strange alchemy of right person, right place, right time. But whatever it had been, Mira was grateful for it, grateful for every moment that had led her here to this garden, with this man building this life. She'd run into vampire territory seeking sanctuary, and she'd found so much more. She'd found home. She'd found healing. She'd found forever. And that, Mira thought as Alexander kissed her under the stars, was the best ending she could have ever asked for.